visa. If you don't sign it and you're not present, you might lose your visa status. So, sign the paper, make everybody's life easier. Okay, let's start. We're gonna do a little bit of history to start with. And then we'll look at some of the core concepts that we need to know to understand the lectures that will follow. I will try to be not too long about history, although I do tend to get completely lost. So if I am blabbling, tell me stop, and I'll stop, and then give you a break, and then we will go to the second part. Okay. This is just quickly what can be covered in competition law, because otherwise you might not actually know what the hell I'm talking about. So competition law can regulate multiple things, and not all jurisdictions regulate the same things. The things that are covered in the US and the EU are largely the same, even though they are treated differently. First of all, agreements. Agreements between companies might be regulated, might violate principles of competition law if they have an impact on competition. We make a distinction between, on the one hand, horizontal agreements, and on the other hand, vertical agreements. And I will talk about this much more when we are in the lecture on agreements. But what you need to understand now is that horizontal agreements are agreements between competing companies. Companies that are direct competitors of each other, that operate on the same level in the same industry. Yeah? And pretty much every jurisdiction agrees that these are bad. Okay? Although you might think it's a given that an agreement between competitors restricts competition and therefore is bad. Actually, as I hope you will learn when I talk about the history of competition law, that's actually a very recent development in Europe, thinking that this is bad. Okay? Then there's vertical agreements. These are agreements between companies who do not directly compete with each other. You might be a customer of another company. So Apple is a customer of Samsung because Samsung makes phone screens that Apple then buys from Samsung. Those are not in that agreement directly competing with each other. However, that agreement will still be considered problematic because it has an impact on competition. This is an area where jurisdictions differ. Some jurisdictions think vertical agreements between companies who aren't directly competing with each other are bad. Others don't think they're bad, right? Or have a much more nuanced view of them. You will see in Europe, vertical agreements are particularly important because of our single market objective. I'll come back to that. So that's the first thing, agreements. By agreements, we don't just mean when two companies actually agree with each other. We also mean when they're cooperating with each other without having a formal agreement. Okay? A second thing that is covered by competition law is unilateral conduct. Actions, behavior by one company with market power. This is a very controversial area. You might think David Goliath style competition law. When someone says competition law, you might be like, yeah, we're going after the big bad companies. We're breaking up monopolies. But actually, until relatively recently, nobody gave a fuck. Monopolies wasn't part of competition law. It was about cartels, it was about agreements between competitors, not about this one big company. Now, we now seem to agree that we need to control their behavior, but we don't agree on how. If you look at the text of the Sherman Act in the US and the Treaty on the Functioning of the European Union in the EU, you might vaguely remember from our introduction class that texts are different. There are different ways to regulate behavior by one company. You might make it illegal to have a monopoly. Just merely having a monopoly is a breach of the law. Or you might say monopolies are fine, but once you have the status of monopoly, the size of a monopoly, certain behaviors can no longer be allowed. Like you can no longer decide to charge particular prices. Or you might have a combo, where you say monopolies are bad if they have been achieved through unfair practices. So it's kind of a mix, right? You are not allowed to be a monopoly if we think you haven't gotten that monopoly completely fairly. Now, the US has fluctuated between monopoly always bad to monopoly bad if we've achieved it through wrong means. But it is very different, at least textually, from the EU that says monopoly is good. Action by monopoly is bad. Yeah? And there's historic reasons for that. And then competition law can also regulate mergers, whether companies can combine, whether one company can buy another company, or two companies can become one new company. That is an important part of competition law, but also relatively recent. And we won't talk about it in these lectures because Mark deals with it in IMC. And then there's state aid. And state aid is a funky European thing, which we also won't talk about, but it's actually really fascinating. The idea behind state aid is that not only do you have to make sure competition between companies is legit, you also need to make sure that the different European governments in the member states don't start favoring their own companies by giving some money. Oh, I want French agricultural companies to be the best in Europe. They're not really. This is not actually true, right? I'm not reflecting on France's agriculture. This is hypothetical. Oh, they're really trash. So what are we going to do? We're going to pump them full of subsidies. French agriculture is decent. Like most agriculture in Europe, totally inefficient, wouldn't survive without European Union money. It's a choice. It's a state aid choice. Pumping money into companies is generally, under certain circumstances, not allowed if you do it on a national level, but we're totally fine with pumping money in European-wide companies. That's totally legit. State aid is a bit of a weird one. It's a European one. I love it. It's fascinating. You don't care, so we're not teaching it. Yeah? Loads of state aid classes around the world, though. It's cool. Or, like, as cool as an academic can find something. Okay, so a reminder of the text. So you will see, or I hope you will see, that Section 1 of the Sherman Act and Article 101 of the Treaty of the Functioning of the European Union are very similar. Yeah? These deal with agreements between competitors, and the text is quite similar. Basically, an agreement that restrains trade is illegal, an agreement that restricts competition is illegal. Yeah? The same isn't the case when you look at unilateral conduct. Section 2 of the Sherman Act says to monopolize is illegal. To monopolize. To form a monopoly is illegal. Whereas 102 says an abuse of dominant position, an abuse of your position as a monopolist is illegal. So how did we get to there? Let's have a little bit of history. Now, sometimes students are like, oh, history is boring. You're wrong. It is not. And the reason it's not boring is that if you know history, you are more clever than pretty much anyone else. Because we now have these debates about hipster antitrust in the US, and like, even in Europe, there's people who are like, ooh, maybe we should break up companies, it will protect democracy. Aren't I clever? No, you're not, right? We've had this debate every 20 years, and you're just repeating the same arguments, and can you please come up with something new? You're not clever. You would have known you're not clever if you knew some history, right? So that's why knowing history is important. So you're not at a conference talking to people about how clever this new idea you have is, and everyone else is like, yeah, dude, we had this discussion and it failed 20 years ago. What is the new angle here? And trust me, this is something that happens all the time. Europeans tend to be less problematic here, but American lawyers, oh my God, they don't know their own history, let alone anybody else's history. It's not their fault, it's their education system. So let's do a bit of history of the US. Now, American antitrust law is like the godfather of antitrust law. Yeah? If you have countries in the world that create a system, they will choose whether they want American style or European style antitrust. And often they choose American style antitrust because it is the most politically influential. America tends to give aid, financial aid around the world on the condition that they implement free market economics. So, not surprisingly, American antitrust tends to be the one that gets spread around the world. Although there are some countries, like Brazil, that tend to have a, hey, we like what the Europeans are doing approach. But American antitrust also has the privilege of having one goal. But that's not always been the case. Actually, if you want an area of law where populism has played the biggest role, it's American antitrust. So we start before the Sherman Act, before 1890, where I hope you all know the English played a big role in the creation of the United States, merely, if anything, by being the big bad wolf. But English law played a massive role in the legal system of the US, especially in the beginning, to the extent that many states copy-pasted English common law into their own system. Do you know what the difference is between common law systems and civil law systems? If you're not saying yes, is that a no? What's the difference between common law and civil law? You're sitting in the front.
Common law system relies on mostly on rules like case law, and civil law tends to have more written laws to rely on.
Yes. At a very basic level, and it is really basic because things have evolved, but at a really basic level, the origin of common law is judge-made law. The UK is quite interesting because more and more written laws have been created, especially under the influence of the EU. But at its core basis, it is a system of common law where rules are made by judges. It used to be the case, I don't know how much you know about this, that you had traveling judges in England, and they would basically solve problems on a case-by-case basis, and eventually this became a bit chaotic, and judges started learning from each other and saying, oh, that judge came up with a really good solution, I'll do that again, right? Civil systems, like Napoleon-inspired systems, are not like that. They have written rules that you have to follow. Although, of course, it's a really weird distinction because, of course, civil law systems also have judges, and the judges interpret the written rules. And so there's some flexibility there, but that's the idea. Common law made by judges, civil law made by parliament or kings or empirical overlords or whatever, but written down rules. Yeah? So, when the United States first develops its legal system, with the exception of some states like Louisiana, it copy-pastes common law of England. At the time, in England, there was a principle that you are not allowed to restrain trade, to restrict trade with any agreements between competitors. But this didn't mean that such agreements were illegal. It just meant that if you had a contractual conflict, you were in an agreement with a competitor, but you no longer wanted to honor your obligations, you would go to court and say, I think this is a restrictive agreement, and I'm no longer going to respect it. That was pretty much the extent of competition law. There was a principle that you weren't allowed to monopolize an industry, but this was a principle by some errant judge that no other judges ever enforced. So at most, you had this rule, iffy rule, that agreements between competitors weren't allowed, but that would only be something that was relevant if one of the competitors sued the other. Consumers couldn't bring claims, there was no third party who could say this is a problem. Yeah. I mean, is that a problem? It depends. This is the Gilded Age of America. Industry, new inventions, some people getting massively rich. The Rockefeller family started its fortune in the Gilded Age. Yeah? The Carnegies. All those people whose names are still on massive buildings in New York. They amassed their fortune in the Gilded Age. You had railroads, and the person who owned the railroads became wealthy. Rockefeller, I think, I might be wrong, was until recently the richest man in history, right? And he got his fortune from oil refineries in the Gilded Age. You might think this is great, and maybe it's great. At the same time, you've got slavery, child labor, half of the population dying before they're 12. Yeah? And if you got a job, it was a really low wage. You couldn't afford to buy food with what you were paid. And there was no such thing as a normal work week. You worked 7 days out of 7, slept 4 hours, went back to work, and still didn't have enough money to feed your family. People aren't very happy, you know? They're like, ooh, look at this Rockefeller dude standing there, and I'm just here working for him, keeping his business going and dying. It's not the best time to be middle class. So people get angry. The Gilded Era, although it is very often referred to as the Gilded Era, was also the most unhappy era in American history. Yeah. So this is the kind of things you saw in newspapers. So big owners of stores, greedy. Rockefeller buying influence in Congress. So this is the steel company, this is Standard Oil, that's Rockefeller's company. And these are supposedly politicians. Everyone's angry because they think we're poor, and those big companies are getting rich and buying politicians. So, these angry people are voters, at least the men are to some extent, as long as they're white. And they're unhappy. So politicians need to do something about this unhappiness. And so they do what politicians do well. Not all politicians, you need to be nice. And they adopt a law they never mean to enforce. The Sherman Act. So the Sherman Act is adopted, which says that agreements between competitors are illegal, and attempts to create a monopoly are illegal. But are the people happy? No, because the Sherman Act isn't enforced. Actually, it is enforced. Does anybody know who it is used against? Is it used against the Rockefellers of the world?
Unions?
Yes, labor unions. They say, well, if workers come together, that's an agreement that restrains trade. Therefore, it's illegal. No more labor unions. Obviously, not exactly what the people had in mind, but you know. Now you can no longer unionize to get higher wages. It gets even worse. There were 13 cases at the time under the Sherman Act, 12 against labor unions. So people are still angry. But in all this anger, this is also the era of feminism. Why? Because the people who actually get the Sherman Act enforced are women. I know, like, you should feel, this is great. In all this unhappiness, women play the most active part in getting competition law. This is Ida Tarbell. She wrote a massive expose on Rockefeller's organization, Standard Oil. Now, why were people upset with Standard Oil? Who was John D. Rockefeller? He was called the robber baron. Why? Anyone? Okay, put your hands up if you've heard of the name Rockefeller. All right, okay, yes?
Because he was money freelance, I believe he was in the business.
Yes? What kind of unscrupulous business activities? Do you know?
No.
Okay, but that's good. See, John D. Rockefeller is a young man whose father is a con artist. He literally was a snake oil salesman. He went around the country and ripped people off and then ran away. But his mother, of John D. Rockefeller, was a very religious, very honorable woman. So John D. Rockefeller is a bit of a weird one, because he had the idea, at least that is what he said in speeches, that he would amass a financial empire and then give all his money away. But in order to amass that financial empire, he needed to do some shady stuff. But that was all right, it was all good for the greater cause of giving his money away. And actually, true to his word, when he retired, he became one of the most important philanthropists in history. So without him, there's a lot of science we wouldn't have, a lot of art we didn't have. So yeah, he takes some, he gives some. John D. Rockefeller starts with oil refineries in Cleveland, Ohio. And he was clever, right? Like, this is when the oil business started to boom. He says, look, I want to have all of the oil, retail, and refinery. So how am I going to go about this? Well, I'm going to pay the railroad not to transport my competitors' oil. And I'm going to go to my competitors and be like, it's a hard life, isn't it? Just give me your company. Yeah. When they said no, he would then make sure that there were no chemicals, no barrels, nothing available for them to buy, so that they, in practice, couldn't sell their stuff. But then he gave them a really generous price to sell their business to him, so, meh. Ida Tarbell was a daughter of one of those people. She had a personal vendetta, as well as being a journalist. And so she wrote an expose of the Standard Oil Company. And she got, this is Standard Oil, by the way, this is the illustrations that came with the expose. She got a very important person to pay attention, Theodore Roosevelt. Theodore Roosevelt is now still known as the trust buster. Now, the trust is something Rockefeller invented, at least in competition law. It was this legal vehicle you had in English law, in American law, where you could take your assets and give them to someone else, and that someone else would make sure they were taken care of. Interestingly, in American state law, in the different states, you weren't allowed to have a company that was operating in different states. But John D. Rockefeller had gone out of his way to acquire all the oil refineries in different states. And technically he wasn't allowed to do that because he wasn't allowed to have one company in multiple states. So he decided to give these companies in trust to some of his family members. So theoretically he wasn't running a big company. He had one company in Cleveland, Ohio, and everybody else had separate companies. So this wasn't technically a monopoly, so this is important to know. It was multiple companies cooperating. So Theodore Roosevelt gets involved and he says he'll protect consumers, he'll protect small business against the atrocity of Standard Oil. You need to know that Rockefeller cut oil prices by 90%, right? So this was the cheapest oil had ever been. So it was actually pretty good for a lot of people who were purchasing oil. So the reason Theodore Roosevelt goes after Standard Oil is not to protect customers, but to protect small competitors. Yeah? Interestingly, he brings a Standard Oil case, and he hates the result. Theodore Roosevelt hates the result. Because Standard Oil gets broken up into 34 different companies. All these new companies actually increase Rockefeller's net worth. He becomes the richest man because of the Standard Oil being broken up. And Rockefeller says, look, I actually really like big companies. I don't see what the problem is. I didn't bring this case to break up Standard Oil. It just went completely out of my hands. The Supreme Court decided to break up this company. Damn, this is not what I was intending. And yet he's gone down in history as a trust buster. He would roll in his grave. So you have the Standard Oil case, but the Standard Oil case establishes something interesting called the rule of reason. Does anyone know what the rule of reason is? Think back to the section 1 text. It says any agreement, any contract that is a restraint of trade or commerce is illegal. Do you remember in the first class I said this outlaws everything? Do you remember that vaguely? That means any contract between any companies, because all of these always have an impact on commerce, is illegal. And the Supreme Court says, look, we're going to break up Standard Oil. Well, let's be clear here. We're only doing it because this is an unreasonable practice, yeah? Because buying up everything is unreasonable, because creating a legal vehicle to go around other laws is illegal. It's unreasonable. We're not doing it just because it's a contract between companies, we're doing it because it's an unreasonable contract, yeah? So this is happening. At the same time, there's also no merger control. So what do you think companies do when they see the Standard Oil case? When they see that contracts between companies can be broken up? What do you think companies start doing? They merge. Now I told you that wasn't allowed under state law, except in one particular state, New Jersey. All these companies move to New Jersey and merge. And so people look at this and are like, this is a total mess. And so you have the 1912 presidential election where everyone's fighting everyone about, is antitrust law even reasonable? Why do we have this? Should we say that all agreements are illegal? Should we get rid of it? Theodore Roosevelt tries to win again, but his, I led to the breakup of Standard Oil, but I'm actually really unhappy with what happened. Let's cancel antitrust law isn't very popular. You have a presidential candidate called Debs who's like, we like monopolies. Monopoly is good. Monopoly is good as long as they're in state hands. Yeah? basically communist of his time. And then you've got Woodrow Wilson, and Woodrow Wilson is kind of in the middle. He says, look, antitrust law is good, but antitrust law needs to be a government thing. So we will create a government agency called the Federal Trade Commission. Yeah, and this is when the Federal Trade Commission springs to life, which is under judicial review, but it's still a government vehicle. In addition, they make certain types of mergers illegal, and they basically strip down the rule of reason by adopting the Clayton Act, which says tying, so offering two products together, is illegal. Having exclusivity agreement is illegal. Selling to different prices at different prices to different people, price discrimination is illegal. So the Clayton Act basically has a whole list of things that companies aren't allowed to do. Now, when you hear antitrust hipsters, this is what they've now started calling themselves, talk, they will say they're following the new Brandeisian approach to antitrust law. The reason they say that is because normally after every great man is a woman, in this case, behind every great man is an academic. Louis Brandeis is actually the one who came up with all these ideas. His goal was to make antitrust a vehicle not to save the economy, but to increase wages. He's the one who invented privacy law to ensure privacy, data protection in our day and age. He's the one who basically wants to use antitrust as a way to make everybody's lives better. Okay? And this would have been great if it had actually been enforced, but you have the First World War that distracts people a little. And then you've got the Roaring Twenties. And we call these the Roaring Twenties because this is the time when people start buying things on credit. Yeah, suddenly everyone is doing a little bit better. They buy cars and promise to pay them off over 5 years. Banks start cashing in on this, creating new investment vehicles. I think you've heard all of this more recently. And the politicians say, let's not get involved in the economy. The economy is doing fine. This is Andrew Mellon. The government at the time consisted exclusively of multimillionaires. One of them, Andrew Mellon, the Secretary of the Treasury, who says, business is what matters. And that would have been great, except what happens at the end of the 20s? The Wall Street crash. So, the Roaring Twenties, a time of prosperity, full of no more enforcement of antitrust, business is great. Nobody is unhappy until the Wall Street crash. 30% lose their job overnight. Those that keep their job, their wages are reduced. There's long bread lines. And we go back, there's a reverse. How do you deal with this? First, the president says, we don't have to deal with this. In fact, we have to create more monopolies and more cartels. There is an act called the National Industrial Recovery Act, which says cartels are good. Cartels are efficient and they will revive the economy. The Supreme Court says that this act is illegal, and so for a while nobody knows what to do. Technically, the president says antitrust is bad, we shouldn't enforce it, but the Supreme Court says actually you should. At the end of the 30s, so the New Deal is this idea of monopolies good, monopolies will help us. At the end though, after the Supreme Court turns down this Industrial Recovery Act, this basically new socialism where we'll have government monopolies, they adopt the Robinson-Patman Act that says, look, if we're going to have antitrust law, we're going to make clear that it's for one particular reason. Why? Why, in the 30s, is antitrust law useful? Do politicians think? No. To protect small companies, to protect competitors. You might often hear American politicians saying that Europe protects, in the 21st century, competitors and not competition. But for most of the history of the United States, antitrust law was designed to protect small companies, not to protect consumers. Right? So the Robinson-Patman Act is adopted to make it clear what the goal of antitrust law is. Okay? And then in the 50s and 60s, things go a little bit better. And there's more money, and there's a school called the Harvard School, which comes up with this theory of competition. And the theory of competition is that it doesn't matter exactly what companies do, as long as you've got a lot of companies on the market. We now call this the structure conduct paradigm. It's the idea that you need to have a lot of companies in the market, and that's what antitrust should protect. So monopoly is always illegal, right? Because you need multiple companies in the market. This leads to some interesting cases, like the brown shoe case, which was a merger between two shoe retailers, and collectively they would have 7% of the market after their merger. And the Supreme Court says, yes, but instead of 5 companies, we will now have 4 companies in the market. So it's illegal, this merger. You have a case where there is a company, Utah Pie, which is a pie seller, a company with quite an important position in the local market. There is a new company that wants to come in from another state, and as a result of that new company coming in, the prices go down. But since the prices go down, it's difficult for smaller companies to survive, and thus this is illegal. You can see where this is going, right? Initially, a lot of people like the Harvard School idea until things get out of hand and you can no longer merge if you'll finally have 7% of the market. What an amazing position. And out of this, there's a lot of rebellion, and you get this man called Borch. I'm pretty sure he was a horrible human being, but what do I know? Who wrote a piece where he was basically advocating you should hardly ever go after monopolies or cartels unless they are inefficient. A lot of people say that Borch, who was one of the proponents of what we now call the Chicago School, that Borch was advocating for consumer welfare, but that is wrong. He used the word consumer welfare in his treatise called the Antitrust Paradox, but he didn't mean making consumers better off. He meant making companies more efficient even if it harms consumers. So I don't know why he wrote consumer welfare, but if you read the text, you'll see that's not what he meant. But still, people in America are like, Chicago School, consumer welfare, and you're like, there is a good argument for saying you want the most efficient companies, but it is not consumer welfare, because the most efficient companies may not be good for consumers. Anyway, so the Chicago School also advocated that judges tended to be bad at regulating the economy and were likely to make mistakes, and therefore should, on the whole, not enforce antitrust law. Yeah, we call this the error cost analysis. I can talk about that more later. But Borch's ideas revolutionized antitrust law. Antitrust law in America goes from being something that's supposed to protect small competitors, or protect workers, or protect consumers, to being all about creating the most efficient firms, even and often if that means making the biggest firms. We now are in what we call the post-Chicago era, and that a lot of the ideas of Chicago School have been proven wrong, but we still adopt them. And the reason we still adopt them is really simple. They're easy to understand. They're very intuitive. There are schools where academics teach judges, and those are usually Chicago School academics. One of the people I have organized a lot of conferences with is Jeff Mann. His dad, Henry Mann, ran schools for judges. And Chicago School was taught there because it's intuitive. A judge doesn't have to understand anything in order to be able to apply these rules. So they stuck around. To the point where even the Belgian Court of Commerce in Antwerp, I was looking at cases yesterday, cites Borch. It made me want to kill myself. But it's intuitive. Then we arrive at the last year or two, where people are like, it needs to protect workers, antitrust needs to protect privacy, antitrust is there to protect small companies. And you're like, well, we can't do everything, make up your mind. So we're basically back at square one. And actually the presidential election in America is about antitrust now. We're cool, we're hip, yeah? Elizabeth Warren is running on the Break Up the Tech Giants platform. Change antitrust law. It's great. I've never felt so involved in the real world. Okay, any questions about the US? I know it's a lot of history, and you don't need to know all of this. But if you want to have good marks on essays, it's good to understand it. Yeah? You all look so bored, it's great. Alright, let's do Europe. So, I don't know how much you know about the history of this continent, but it's a bit of a mess. This is the map in 1815. This is the map in 1914. We don't seem to stick with boundaries. Like, my country of Belgium has changed boundaries so often, we're supposedly, the Flemish government is making this canon of Flemish history, which is wrong on so many levels, and Flemish culture and what it means to be Flemish, and they can't even agree where to draw the boundaries. Is this guy Dutch or is he Flemish? This is why. This means that competition law isn't really a thing. You have loads of countries where you have sort of rules that regulate how big companies can behave, but they're not competition laws we know it now. You've got France, where they regulate the prices monopolies can charge. Yeah? You've got Germany, where there are rules about how you can treat your customers and your trading partners, but there is no real competition law. In fact, competition law would be anathema, because what we really wanted at the time was conquer the world. And how do you conquer the world? By having big companies. The Dutch East India Company, which was a monopoly, managed to rule the world and help the Dutch government to conquer loads of lands. That wouldn't have been possible if it was break up the giants. So actually, government likes monopolies. They like cartels. And even those laws that there are from time to time are usually not enforced. A lot of people say that the origin of competition law in Europe is Germany, but it's actually Austria. I don't want to be pedantic, but they're not the same, right? Austria is where it starts. You have a financial crisis in the 1870s, and people get really upset about wealth, income inequality, and in Vienna they start having discussions about should we maybe regulate big companies, they are so wealthy, whereas everybody else isn't. They almost adopt a competition law that looks remarkably like the Sherman Act that arrives 20 years later. But there's this thing, there's the Austro-Hungarian Empire who decide that it's maybe time to go conquer some more lands. The Czechs are revolting, the Jews are revolting. Not time to start thinking about competition law, so they abandon the law. But if we're technical, that's where it starts. And Germany, academics from Vienna actually start having these discussions in Germany as well, in Belgium as well, and so on. But it never actually becomes law. Europe tries from time to time to tackle big companies, but it always fails because of geopolitical reasons. It's all a little bit confused. The French suddenly want to conquer the Belgians, and they're like, oh, we can only do this if we have big land. The Belgians decide that Congo is pretty nice looking, but we need our monopolies to invade that country. It never really works out. And then you've got the interbellum between the First World War and the Second World War. And in the after the First World War, there is economic crisis, especially in countries like Belgium. Does anyone know why Belgium and then Germany would have been hit the hardest? Because of the economic problems in the US. After the UK, Belgium is the first industrialized country on the continent, and Germany is one of the biggest trading blocs. So when commerce is halted in the US, Belgium and Germany suffer the most. Interestingly, whereas in America this leads to a call for antitrust law, in Belgium and Germany it leads to the total opposite. Nationalization of monopolies. Monopolies become government-owned. It's weird, isn't it? Like, we have totally different reactions. Eventually this leads to this. Does anybody know which company this is? I'm guessing the Germans will.
IG FAB.
Yes? Can you tell me why it's there?
I think it made the gas for the concentration camps and bombs and stuff like this.
Yes, it made Zyklon B.